I'm a very big fan of the foundation and its work, which I think, you always say these things, but honestly, they couldn't be more important, especially now.
My name's Jim Rosner. I'm chairman of the ABMF, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Lee Feinstein and American Battle Monuments Commission historian Michael Knapp.
I wonder if you could give us a little bit of background of the challenges in the sort of late post-Cold War relations with Poland and both the U.S. As well as the EU.
When I was serving in Warsaw, things were different, but they were also the same. I think at that time, Warsaw, but also the Baltic states and other U.S. allies and also friends, and including Ukrainians, were concerned and were sounding alarms about what Russia's intentions were in terms of its relations with Russia and also the former Soviet space more generally, and more broadly in terms of its global posture. One of the things I worked hardest on, and which I'm very proud of during my time there, which was to negotiate what was modest, but was the first presence of U.S. forces on Polish territory, which was, as you said, Jim, an aviation detachment. What it did is it created an initial presence, but also a legal framework for going forward, and unfortunately being able to respond as the United States has and as NATO has to the threat from Russia now that it's invaded Ukraine for the second time. I would say if you're asking about challenges in the relationship, I just had the privilege and have joined by my colleague Lexi Schmidt on this call to meet with a prominent Polish former government official who now is the president of the Polish Confederation of Private Employers, Leviatan. And she was saying that the war against Ukraine by Russia has had a major impact on Poland in some unexpected ways, one of which was, and now I'm paraphrasing what she said, really to erase, and I know we've got a lot of historians, including Michael on the call, but to really erase and repair historical tensions between Poland and Ukraine, because it's easy to overlook the fact that in the kind of margins of World War II, Poland and Ukraine were engaged in very bitter and bloody border conflicts, which many Poles have direct experience of either themselves or through their parents or grandparents. And when 9 million plus refugees flooded over the border from Ukraine to Poland, as widely known, Poles, literally everyone I know took Ukrainians into their homes in a kind of a uniquely organic refugee resettlement program, and those refugees are in many cases still in Poland. So that's a kind of, if you can find a silver lining, one of it is a kind of historical reconciliation between Poland and Ukraine. Americans and Poles see the threat from Russia on similar terms. They feel, of course, concerned about the war on their doorstep, but also encouraged that there are now more than 10,000 American troops on Polish soil, and that the United States has responded with over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine. So there's a much greater alignment. When I arrived, it was the beginning of the Obama administration. The Obama administration, it seems hard to believe, but was discussing a reset in relations with Russia. and that provoked a very strong and negative response in Central and Eastern Europe because of a sense that people were underestimating what Putin's intentions were.
Do you see a change in the bilateral relationship between Poland and the United States?
Unfortunately, our countries have certain things in common, one of which is vituperation in politics and polarization. So the ability to bring people of different political perspectives to the president's address was very important and significant. And there was applause by the Polish president, prime minister, by the leader of the current right-wing party that's in power now. So I think that's very important. I think President Biden appropriately in his remarks talked about, Poland's resolve and, it really historic reception of refugees in its country. And I think that is also appreciated. There used to be a theory about consolidated democracies, democracies that had been fairly well established, that they only went forward and couldn't go in reverse. And unfortunately, in the last decade or so, we've seen that premise is being very seriously challenged around the world. And I think it wasn't an accident that President Biden emphasized the difference between autocracy and democracy. So, every relationship has areas where there's, a strong agreement and also areas where there are some differences. But I think on the fundamental issue of the response to Russia, there's broad unanimity. Broadly speaking, the U.S. response, I think, has been really appreciated and acknowledged and forged a very strong strategic relationship between Poland and the United States.
Do we still, or should we still see Poland as a champion of freedom and democracy for that Baltic area?
So I'm a former ambassador, so you should take everything I say with the appropriate grain of salt. Adam Michnik, who was the famous founder of Gazeta Wyborcza, which is still an extremely important source of independent news and information in Poland and was an underground newspaper during the Solidarity years, used to say that his hope for Poland was that its revolution was more like the American Revolution than the French Revolution. Mm. And that's always the struggle in a transforming society. And I think that goes to the strength of Polish civil society. Poland has a great tradition of resistance, which led to the transformation that began in 1989, but grew over a long period of time prior to that. And I used to say when I was in Warsaw, and now about a decade ago, that Poland's democratic transformation was one of the most successful in the third wave of democracies. I used to put it alongside South Africa, both imperfect, but both given the past and the challenges, really models for other societies. Obviously, the challenges are greater now. Poland's relationship with the EU is somewhat strained, but if you look at Poland and the strength of its civil society, the debate that continues to exist despite greater state control over certain broadcast media and some efforts to restrict judicial independence, I still am betting on Poland both to continue to move in a democratic direction and also I think to unify, particularly given the threat that they see right on their doorstep. In the Polish case, that the opponents of communism, who came from a wide variety of walks of life and very different political perspectives, united to defeat communism, and then work together to build a new society rather than moving in a direction in which all of the participants in the anti-communist revolution then turned against themselves. The phrase is the French Revolution is, a revolution that eats its own. And that's the challenge in any kind of major political transition. And I think Poland, until now, has had strongly succeeded in that. There are now more cleavages. I think the cleavages in society will not be kind of unfamiliar to us here. They're geographical. They tend to be, in the Polish case, and maybe if in the United States they're north and south. Let's just say, broadly speaking, in Poland, it's not perfect, obviously. In Poland, they're east and west. A lot of it they're rural and urban. They're about parts of the country that have more greatly benefited from European integration, and those parts of the country that have benefited less. And then there are cultural differences, and those get highlighted at a time when there are other cultural divisions. Jaruzelski, who was the Soviet-appointed head of Poland at the time of the Round Table, which was the sort of negotiated and peaceful transition from a Soviet-dominated communist system to a more democratic one. Jaruzelski, actually, his house was across the street from where the American ambassador lives, and he died while I was in office as ambassador. And he was given a modest pension. He was given police protection outside of his house. And when he died, Polish leaders, because he did facilitate, sort of like de Klerk in South Africa, a peaceful transition, was also treated with a measure of respect. And so that, I think, is the kind of example that Michnik was talking about when he wrote about this and speaks about it in public.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the economic impact to Poland, the refugee crisis, which I know you've touched on briefly, and then any broader challenges which are brought about by the ongoing situation on their border, right on their doorstep.
Well, my last trip to Warsaw was a few months ago, and it is a very thriving country economically, and both in terms of attracting a lot of foreign investment, in terms of very, very high levels of education, including and especially in mathematics and in STEM areas, just to go back again, at the time of the transition in 1989, Poland and Ukraine had similar GDPs, and Poland's GDP is now more than 3 times the level of Ukraine's GDP. And that's a function of the fact that they're a member of the EU, and as a member of the EU, they receive roughly about €1 billion a month in what the EU calls cohesion funds and other investments. And they've been very smart about how to use it. They've been investing in infrastructure, education. Polish students are traveling throughout the EU to get EU education. English language competency in Poland is higher than it is in France. In the next decade or so, if the current trend line continue, its GDP is projected to be the same as the UK's, which is really unimaginable just a few years ago. But that is not to say that there aren't issues, and part of the issues go to the fact that there are tensions and differences of opinion, particularly when it comes to rule of law and the judiciary, where the EU is asking for, at this point, fairly modest changes to Polish procedures with respect to the appointment of judges and their authorities, and which have been caught up in a pretty fierce domestic debate in Poland about whether or not to accept those, and that's holding up some of the EU money.
Looking at Ukraine and their I can't think of what the right word is, their request to join the EU. Do you think they're following the Polish model of transition that we saw as Poland moved out of the Soviet orbit?
I would say Ukraine is working very hard, and President Zelensky is working very hard to try to address real concerns about corruption, to limit, to place limits, and ultimately to eliminate the power of oligarchs in Ukraine. That has really hampered Ukraine's development since the transition, and made worse and more difficult because of Russian interference and pressure on Ukraine. So I would say the requirements of the war and the heroic response, and I don't think there's another word to describe it, of President Zelensky, I think are a positive indication about Ukraine's ability to emerge victorious, and also with a much stronger governmental infrastructure that will allow them to grow.
And I know those of us that are not, strong European diplomatic scholars tend to look at Poland as kind of a harbinger, and I wonder if you see it that way.
Historical memory is a huge and important issue, and obviously it's a huge and important issue to everybody on this call, and particularly to the foundation, which is why I'm such a big fan of its work. Poles live daily and experience daily their own history. One of the things I experienced was the ways in which that developed over time and continues to develop. A lot of the ability to take stock of the events of World War II, communist period, were really short-circuited by Soviet domination of Poland. And so some of the efforts to look back onto World War II to understand Poland's history, its relationship to its neighbors as well, a lot of that was just suspended for the 45 years of Cold War. One of the places where I've seen that addressed in some very meaningful and important ways is honestly through public efforts, including monuments and memorials that exist in Poland, many of which were cooperative efforts between Polish government and civil society. So that's just tremendously important. I think the thing to remember is that countries and societies and cultures, it's for them to engage in the effort to grapple with these historical issues, and they're going to do it in their own way and in their own time. But there's been a real effort in Polish society to grapple with its past and to deal with it. And one of the things that our visitor yesterday was saying is that the surge of Ukrainian refugees crossing the border reminded everybody of how they felt in Poland, prior to the transition, before they were members of NATO, before they were members of the European Union, and before they felt strongly anchored in the West. Jim was kind enough to mention my work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I'm now the vice chair of the Committee on Conscience, which is a group that was established at the founding of the museum by Elie Wiesel, to focus on contemporary atrocity situations. You mentioned Bucha, and of course we're seeing this in several different areas of temporary Soviet occupation in Ukraine. I think it was extremely meaningful to Poles to hear Vice President Harris at the Munich Security Conference last week say that the United States had determined that Russia committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. I mean, it's inarguable that they have, but it's also important to be very deliberate and meticulous in developing the evidence and having a record of it. But yeah, I mean, Poland was the location of the Nazi killing fields, and Poland suffered more than any other country, and so these are seen very personally. And I think Poles also feel they want the world to better understand what their experience was during World War II, and sometimes feel that there isn't sufficient appreciation, correctly or not, of that fact. So I think that their warnings, but not just theirs, as you were pointing out, Michael, the others in Central and Eastern Europe, including the Balts, and the Balkans, about what Putin's intentions were and what his way of war has been around the world, now being fully understood and acknowledged by others is very meaningful, and it's an important role that the Poles can play and have played historically.
But I wonder if we can kind of look at Poland as again sort of a window into the whole Eastern Europe and to the reactions and what may change in the post-Soviet era, but especially more so now, given the war in Ukraine and how it seems like Russia is basically striving under Putin to get back to the Cold War Soviet sphere of influence. We just saw, I think, just today that they're repudiating the treaty agreement that they had with Moldova. They've decided to pull out of the last nuclear SALT agreement with the U.S. Any thoughts on what that looks like?
Well, the announcement by Putin that he was suspending Russian participation in the Near START treaty was very concerning. There are other arms control agreements that are still in place, but this was the last standing agreement that regulated offensive nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons. And so, the sort of generations worth of work to stabilize and put controls on nuclear weapons between what we used to call the superpowers is, already was, but this is just another indication in great jeopardy. That was a kind of a major achievement of diplomacy over many years. And so it's hard to overstate the significance of that. I would very much like to see this as an opportunity for Poland on a more fundamental level domestically to unify or to find common ground among Poles of different points of view. In terms of Poland's place in the world, I've always felt that Poland in its sort of solidarity and post-solidarity period was a real model of a political and economic transformation, and an example of how of what people can do to transform the day-to-day lives and opportunities of people with determination, commitment, and openness. There's a lot of talk about Poland becoming kind of the new center, the political center of Europe and the EU. I personally think that is true and not true at the same time. Now, I think, given its strong response to the attack on Ukraine, really has an opportunity to play a bigger role geopolitically.
I want to relay some questions to you in the order that I got them. So I understand there are American forces in Poland, but I believe many would question why we still have a military presence in Germany at all.
That's that's a great question. I mean, there was no continuous presence of U.S. forces in Poland until 2012. And now it's 11,000, and I think it's the potential to grow, and I think that that's important. So I agree with the question that there needs to be a permanent presence in Poland, and the presence that's calibrated to enhance Poland's security and more generally NATO's security, and to deter any attacks and threats to Poland. So I do think that that's essential. The infrastructure that exists in Germany, I mean, first of all, it's much. The number of troops is greatly reduced from what it was during the Cold War period, when there were 300,000 American troops in Poland. It's now in Germany. It's now well under 50,000. But there's a lot of infrastructure, and there's a lot of other activities that take place in Germany, so long as the Germans continue to support that kind of a presence, and so long as it makes, political military sense, including to reinforce, what are now frontline states, I think it makes sense.
I have another question from Commissioner Smith. It seems the Polish government's response and support for the Ukraine conflict has at least temporarily abated concern for their growing authoritarian policies. Do you feel the experiences supporting the Ukraine conflict and NATO will in any way change the course toward more authoritarian policies?
We're Poland and the United States and Ukraine supporters are focused on bringing this war to a conclusion on terms that Ukraine considers to be victory, and that naturally, as happens in wartime, means that you prioritize some things and other things get less priority. But at the same time, this is not a time to look away, because the strength of our effort and the strength of sustaining support for the effort in Ukraine, in this country, but more broadly, just depends on being strong at home. Because any kind of strong foreign policy requires a basic level of consensus domestically on what a good foreign policy is. In Poland, it's easier because the war is right on their doorstep. But even so, if Poland is divided internally, it doesn't advance or strengthen their efforts. And of course, Putin is excellent at trying to sow divisions. He has tried to do that on cultural issues in Poland and in the United States and throughout Europe, and with some success. And that's not something we ought to let him do. So that's very closely tied to, in the right way, making it clear that this is advice we have to give to ourselves equally. We got to get our act together at home. Thank you all. Really appreciate the chance to compare notes with you and to share views. And thanks, Michael, for great introduction, and Jim for very gracious hosting. Thank you so much.